It is not just those so-called radical activist left judges who are ruining Donald Trump's Liberation Day trade policies. He's now posted on Truth Social saying the Chinese have totally violated the agreement. But were the policies ever legally sound in the first place? The White House is now working at speed to try and salvage President Trump's flagship tariffs agenda by turning to a plan B. What is it? Let's hear from George Grylls, who's Times' correspondent in Washington. Good afternoon, George.
Good afternoon.
Well, so what is the plan
from
B?
here.
Yes, good morning to you. What is the plan B?
So essentially, Trump has found himself kind of stalled by this flurry of legal disputes that have halted his tariffs. And he is basically, because he used this Emergency Powers Act, he was basically saying that because of the flow of fentanyl, Chinese-made fentanyl from supposedly Mexico and Canada, this was an emergency, and therefore he had to impose sweeping tariffs across the world. Now, initially a court in Manhattan said, well, that argument doesn't fly. They've managed to kind of basically stay that court's ruling pending an appeal. But now they're basically looking at other laws, even reviving kind of laws from the Depression era, from the 1930s, to see if there's other ways that they can just impose these sweeping tariffs, because it's basically what the courts have kind of held up is the idea that he can just impose random tariffs on entire countries rather than going on a kind of sector by sector basis. So the tariffs, for example, on cars and steel and aluminium, they can still stay in place, and there doesn't seem to be much kind of legal dispute over that. It's the kind of idea that, for example, you say to Lesotho was one that seemingly got badly hit when he announced Liberation Day last month. We're going to impose 50% or whatever it is on your entire economy.
And he's been venting on Truth Social about the judges again, hasn't he?
Yes, he's kind of describing, as he calls them, kind of radical left judges. It's not, entirely surprising, but he's also kind of come after this guy called Leonard Leo, who's a kind of conservative legal scholar, which is interesting. He called him a sleazebag on Truth Social last night. And Leonard Leo is kind of one of these figures who basically helps and kind of steers the conservative appointments on the Supreme Court. So he was one of the ones who kind of recommended, if you remember, in Trump's first term, he appointed 3 justices on the Supreme Court. So the fact that Trump is going after him and saying he basically got bad legal advice by using this emergency law is quite interesting. It's quite a rift.
Fascinating stuff. Well, George Grylls, thank you very much for joining us, Times' correspondent in Washington there. Let's turn now to Everett Eisenstat, who's former Deputy Director of the National Economic Council during Trump's first term, and he's on the line now. Good afternoon, Everett.
Hi, good afternoon. How are you today?
Well, I'm very good. Thank you very much for coming on the programme. Just want to ask you first about what we were hearing there from George about this Plan B that the White House is putting in place to use other laws that Donald Trump will try and get round the judgment of the courts. Do you think this will work?
Well, I think it's important to remember these laws were always available to the president. Now, he chose to use IEPA in this instance, but as also was noted, there's still a number of tariffs in place under Section 232, which are sectoral tariffs, and they cover wide range of products. In addition, the tariffs on China under Section 301, which is a country-specific unfair trading practices investigation, those remain in effect as well. So, as was rightly noted, it's the IEPA tariffs that the courts ruled on. But
that's
also
the emergency powers, isn't it, you're talking about there?
Yeah, it's the International Emergencies Economic Powers Act, which has a lot of flexibility to it, and the boundaries of that have not been tested in the courts in this way. So this is a precedent-setting ruling, both of these courts. Now, both courts ruled that this was not an appropriate use of that IEPA authority, but they also have stayed that judgment. One court stayed its own judgment, the other was stayed by an appellate court. So, in effect, for all, candidly, the tariffs remain in place for now. They're being considered by the courts, but this is going to take some time to work its way through the system. So in many ways, I don't know that the president needs to go to a plan B right now.
But there's a lot of uncertainty, which is doing untold damage to the American economy, isn't it?
Well, I'm not I've been told many times I'm not an economist, so I've never claimed to be one.
Well,
Sure, everybody likes predictability. Everybody, appreciates knowing what the playing field is, and I think the court's ruling takes what some had kind of adjusted to was this new reality that these tariffs were probably going to stay in place, and this creates some more uncertainty, which makes it hard to make a decision about when to invest, where to invest. But I think the trend lines are pretty clear. Tariffs are going to be higher. There is more of a movement, not just in the United States, but globally towards this idea of like self-reliance and being sure that you're not relying on other economies for very important national security sectors. So I think some of those fundamentals remain in place and are still going to drive a lot of the decision making.
how concerned are you about what Trump's saying about the judges and the judiciary generally? They're hitting out these sort of radical left judges. Are you worried by that?
Well, it's also unfortunately a pattern that it's not just President Trump. It's a lot of individuals or institutions that feel like it's better to attack the institution or the person than to go after the issue.
Mm.
And that is not always the most productive way, but certainly the president has a right and to state his opinion. And if that's the way he feels, he certainly can say that.
But isn't there a danger that, for example, it's gone further than stating his opinion? His administration is ignoring rulings, for example, on the deportations. And there's a sort of chipping away at the foundations of a functioning democracy, isn't there?
I don't know that he's ignoring the rulings. I mean, there's a difference of, degree of compliance, yes, but I don't think he's ignoring the rulings. In fact, he said in his spokespersons have said that he's going to comply with these rulings.
So the rule of law is still sacrosanct in America, is it?
Yes, absolutely.
And a good thing too, I assume you think.
I do like the rule of law, yes. And
good to have that confirmed. I mean, I ask because, when you see what Donald Trump has posted on Truth Social about Leonard Leo, for example, who recommended the justices that Trump appointed, do you think he's looking at basically packing the judiciary with his own sort of MAGA activists to counteract, as he sees it, the radical left judges?
What I find really interesting about that question is that it takes a fact pattern and applies a whole, like this is a result of this one person. It's not. The idea of packing the courts has been around for decades. In fact, President Roosevelt wanted to pack the courts. And this is exactly the way a democracy works, is you have the courts who weigh in, you have Congress who weighs in. And yes, does it take time? Is it a little bit messy? Of course it is. But that's democracy. And the fact that we have this give and take and we have the ability to question institutions, that's not a bad thing. In fact, I think that's part of a vibrant democracy. So, this story is in unfolding. It's in no way is it over, and it's going to evolve. And we'll see give and take between the courts, the Congress, and the judiciary regarding tariffs and other matters for many, many years. And that'll happen. It's happened before President Trump, and it's certainly going to happen after his term in office.
Do you think this uncertainty will stop countries signing trade deals with America? Because, we heard today the US Treasury Secretary talking about the US-China talks having stalled, and the markets had a bit of a reaction to that. Do you think that's an issue?
I think that it's important to distinguish China negotiations from other negotiations. And the reason being that the fundamental tariffs that are applicable to China are primarily under Section 301, which are those country-specific unfair trading practices tariffs. And those remain in place. Those could be broadened or increased, and I don't think they would be subject to much court challenge. And the negotiations and the discussions with China have been going on for, 20, 25 years. We've been working to resolve some of the concerns, and it's not just the U.S. that has concerns with some of the Chinese economic practices. So I would put those over there. The fact that the president is concerned that China is not abiding by the agreements which they had made in Geneva, that's a little bit of a separate issue. And one of the concerns there is that their export licenses for critical goods and magnets and things that are necessary for manufacturing, that there's a feeling that those were not being honored, those were not being issued, and that was against the agreement. Now, of course, China has its perspective as well. They're going to work through that, and it's going to be a continuing negotiation. The other negotiations were somewhat under the reciprocal tariffs under the AIPA, which is before the courts now.
Mm.
I don't think countries are going to back away from those negotiations. It may affect the pace, but the reality is the 232 tariffs are still in place. There's a lot of common interest in reaching an agreement, and I think most countries would be wise and probably will stay at the table for continued discussions on a trade outcome.
Everett Eisenstat, thank you very much for joining us, former Deputy Director of the National Economic Council during Trump's first term, so he knows the mind of the man now back in the White House.